don't really listen to a whole lot of music anymore. I used to listen to a lot different music, but trying to focus now just on gospel music. I try to keep my focus on God, what He wants me to do.
For nearly half a century, fans around the world have refused to believe that Elvis Presley truly left us in August of 1977. His death was supposed to be the end of a legend, but for millions, it only sparked the beginning of a mystery. And at the center of that mystery stands a quiet pastor from Benton, Arkansas, Bob Joyce. To some, he is just a preacher spreading faith and gospel. To others, he is the living embodiment of a rumor that will not die. The whispers began innocently enough. A video surfaced online of Pastor Bob Joyce leading worship. His voice, rich and commanding, carried a tone that sent chills down the spines of listeners. It wasn't just powerful, it was familiar. Too familiar. The vibrato, the phrasing, the soul embedded in every note, it sounded exactly like Elvis Presley. For fans who had spent years longing for their idol, the resemblance was uncanny, almost supernatural. From there, the comparisons only grew. Side-by-side photos of Bob Joyce and older renderings of what Elvis might have looked like in his later years began circulating across forums, Facebook groups, and fan clubs. The broad jawline, the piercing eyes, even the way he carried himself in front of a microphone, everything seemed to align. "That's Elvis," some declared with certainty. "He faked his death, and this is where he ended up." The rumor caught fire. Thousands of believers claimed that Elvis had become disillusioned with fame, crushed by the weight of his own legend, and staged his death to escape. According to them, he left behind the world of flashing cameras and screaming crowds for the solace of faith and the humility of ministry. The king, they argued, had traded rhinestones for robes, the stage for the pulpit. But it wasn't just the voice or the appearance that fueled the obsession, it was the timing. Elvis died at 42. Pastor Bob Joyce first appeared in ministry not long after, already carrying the wisdom and gravity of a man who had lived several lives. To fans hungry for clues, it all felt too perfect, too aligned to be coincidence. Online communities turned the theory into a movement. YouTube channels devoted hours of footage to analyzing every detail, zooming in on Bob Joyce's hands, measuring his jawline, dissecting his singing technique. People swore the gospel recordings of Bob Joyce carried the exact same breath patterns Elvis once used in concert. They argued no impersonator could possibly sustain such perfection. Not for years, not with such conviction. For believers, Pastor Bob wasn't an impersonator. He was Elvis Presley himself, hiding in plain sight, still alive, still singing, but finally free. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pointed out that Elvis's death certificate, coroner's reports, and the testimony of family members confirmed his passing beyond question. They argued the resemblance was coincidence, the voice a gift that simply echoed Elvis's style. Yet the denials only seemed to strengthen the believers. Of course they'd cover it up, fans insisted. If Elvis wanted to disappear, everyone close to him would have protected that choice. And so the movement grew. Half tribute, half conspiracy, all wrapped in the enduring power of a man the world never wanted to lose. Pastor Bob Joyce became more than a preacher. He became the vessel for a collective hope, that Elvis had not been consumed by fame, that he had found peace, that somehow, against all odds, he was still alive. The rumors reached a breaking point when Pastor Bob himself was asked about them. Standing before his congregation, he addressed the whispers with a mixture of firmness and compassion. "I am not Elvis Presley," he declared. His words were clear, but for many the denial wasn't enough. They pointed out how carefully he spoke, how his eyes seemed to carry the weight of secrets. If he truly wasn't Elvis, why did the resemblance cut so deep? Why did the sound of his voice feel like a ghost come to life? For believers, that moment only added fuel to the fire. They claimed the denial was just another act of protection, a necessary disguise to keep the illusion intact. And for skeptics, it was proof that the world's obsession with Elvis had crossed into fantasy. Yet the question lingers, louder now than ever. Could Pastor Bob Joyce really be Elvis Presley? Or is he simply the man unlucky enough, or perhaps blessed enough, to carry the voice of a legend? What's certain is that the mystery has taken on a life of its own. Entire communities have built themselves around the theory, dissecting every sermon, every note, every photograph. The rumor refuses to die because, deep down, people don't want it to. The thought that Elvis might have escaped the prison of his fame and found freedom in faith is too powerful, too redemptive to let go. And when Pastor Bob finally addressed the crowd directly, his words left them not with clarity, but with questions that echoed louder than ever. Because even as he denied the identity, the resemblance spoke for itself. And what he said next would stun not only his congregation, but the world. When it comes to the claim that Pastor Bob Joyce is really Elvis Presley, believers say the evidence is overwhelming. To them, it's not just about a voice or a passing resemblance, it's about a trail of clues that stretches all the way back to August 16, 1977, the day Elvis was declared dead. And those clues, they argue, tell a story very different from the one written in history books. It begins with the day of his death. Fans recall the confusion surrounding the official reports. Newspapers contradicted one another, and the timeline of events at Graceland never seemed completely clear. Some said the body looked different, swollen, altered in ways that didn't make sense for a healthy 42-year-old man only hours before. There were whispers that the casket had been kept closed as much as possible because the face wasn't recognizable. To believers, this wasn't proof of natural decline, it was evidence of a cover-up. Then came the funeral. Eyewitnesses swore that the body inside the casket didn't look like Elvis at all. They described the skin as waxy, the features too stiff, almost mannequin-like. Some even claimed it was a look-alike, a stand-in created to fool the public. Whether by makeup or something more elaborate, fans said it didn't add up. If Elvis truly lay there, why did so many who had known him for years insist it didn't look like him? The inconsistencies didn't stop there. Official documents listed Elvis's middle name as Aaron, missing the second A in Aaron that he had begun using in later years. Why would his death certificate reflect the old spelling unless something deeper was at play? Skeptics brushed it off as a clerical error. Believers saw it as a deliberate signal, a hidden message that the king had staged his departure. And then, as if on cue, the sightings began. Within weeks of his death, fans reported seeing Elvis at airports, gas stations, even walking down quiet streets. Each account came with its own story. A man with sideburns and sunglasses buying a ticket under a false name, a figure slipping into the back of a diner who looked too familiar to be coincidence. The stories spread like wildfire, fanned by tabloid headlines that screamed, "Elvis lives!" Through the years, those sightings never stopped. From Kalamazoo to Las Vegas, from Memphis to small towns across America, the legend followed. Each story seemed improbable on its own, but together they created a current too strong to ignore. Fans said Elvis hadn't died, he had chosen freedom, escaping a world that had devoured him piece by piece. This is where Pastor Bob Joyce enters the picture. Because when people first heard his voice, the puzzle pieces seemed to click. The tone was identical, rich, deep, powerful. His phrasing, the way he stretched syllables, the soul in every note, it was Elvis, they said, grown older but unchanged at the core. Side-by-side comparisons of Bob Joyce's gospel performances with Elvis's recordings from the 70s left fans convinced. No impersonator could do this, they insisted. It has to be him. It wasn't just the voice. Pastor Bob's mannerisms, his hand gestures, the way he leaned into a microphone, the slight tilt of his head, looked eerily familiar. Even his physical frame drew comparisons. Believers argued that Elvis, if alive today, would look almost exactly like Pastor Bob Joyce, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same man. And then there were the testimonies. Fans who visited Pastor Bob's church in Benton swore they felt Elvis in the room. They described chills as he sang, tears welling up not from nostalgia but from recognition. Some said they looked into his eyes and saw the same warmth, the same spark that once mesmerized arenas of screaming fans. For them, there was no doubt. The question that haunted them was simple. If Bob Joyce really is Elvis Presley, why would he abandon the world's biggest stage to hide in a small Arkansas church? And the answer they gave was equally simple. Because Elvis had already lived the extremes. Fame had nearly destroyed him. Pills, pressure, money, endless performances, it had stripped away his peace, his health, even his sanity. If anyone had a reason to walk away, it was him. Believers argued that faking his death was the only way Elvis could save himself. And in choosing a quiet life of ministry, he had not abandoned the world. He had found redemption. In their eyes, the king had traded the throne of music for the pulpit of faith, finally free from the chains of celebrity. Skeptics dismissed it all as wishful thinking. They said grief can twist memories, that people see what they want to see, and that Elvis impersonators are everywhere. But believers countered that no impersonator could sustain decades of such perfection, not with the exact same vocal DNA, not with the weight of such uncanny similarities. And so the evidence continues to pile up. Funeral mysteries, suspicious documents, endless sightings, and a pastor whose very existence seems to defy coincidence. To the faithful, it's not a question of if Bob Joyce is Elvis, it's a question of why. Why would a man who had it all choose to leave it behind? And the answer, they say, lies not in conspiracy, but in the life Pastor Bob has built since. A life devoted not to music or money, but to God, to faith, and to redemption. But if that's true, then one mystery remains. How much of Pastor Bob's story is his own, and how much belongs to the man the world still calls the King? To understand why the rumor refuses to die, you have to step into the world of Pastor Bob Joyce himself. For decades, he has built a life devoted to ministry, leading a small congregation in Benton, Arkansas. His focus has always been on preaching the gospel, singing hymns, and guiding people toward faith. Yet even as he insists he is nothing more than a humble pastor, his very presence fuels one of the most extraordinary conspiracy theories of all time. Those who attend his services often describe something they can't quite put into words. His voice, deep and commanding, fills the room with a richness that makes people stop in their tracks. It is more than just talent. It feels lived in, shaped by years of passion, experience, and pain. For some, hearing him sing is like hearing a ghost step back into the present. For others, it is undeniable proof that the King himself never left. But Pastor Bob's life is more than his voice. He has spent years counseling people in their struggles, helping them find redemption through faith. His sermons speak often of second chances, of overcoming brokenness, of leaving the past behind to walk into a new life. Those themes strike a powerful chord for those who believe he is Elvis. To them, these words are not just the words of a pastor, they are the testimony of a man who lived through the extremes of fame and emerged on the other side with his soul intact. And yet, Pastor Bob has not ignored the speculation. On several occasions, he has directly addressed the claims. Standing before his congregation, he has said with conviction, "I am not Elvis Presley. I am Bob Joyce." His denials are clear, firm, and delivered with the calmness of a man who has been asked the same question too many times. He calls himself a servant of God, not a survivor of Graceland. Still, the denials don't quiet the movement. If anything, they amplify it. Believers argue that of course he would deny it. To admit the truth would shatter the life of peace he built, unleash a media circus, and undo the very freedom he sought by walking away. They point out that even in his denials, he never mocks the idea, never ridicules those who believe. Instead, he responds with compassion, as if he understands why people cling to the hope that Elvis still lives. Priscilla Presley has been asked about the rumors, and she has dismissed them outright. For her, Elvis's death was final, tragic, and undeniable. Lisa Marie, before her passing, also rejected the claims, insisting her father was gone. Yet even their words could not stop the believers. In fact, some said the very insistence of Elvis's family proved they were protecting a secret. After all, they argued, wouldn't they do anything to protect Elvis's choice to live quietly? The contradiction is almost poetic. On one side, you have a humble pastor who wants nothing more than to preach and sing for God. On the other, you have millions of fans convinced he is the most famous entertainer of all time, hiding in plain sight. The tension between the two has created a storm of fascination that neither Pastor Bob nor Elvis's family can fully control. Psychologists say this is the natural result of a world that never wanted to let Elvis go. His death came too suddenly, too painfully for fans to accept. So when a man appeared decades later with a familiar face, a familiar voice, and a message of redemption, the pieces fell into place. Pastor Bob became the vessel for a dream, that Elvis had escaped, had survived, and had found peace. Whether intentional or not, Pastor Bob's ministry only adds to the myth. His focus on rebirth, on leaving behind the old life to embrace the new, mirrors exactly what fans imagine Elvis would have wanted. It's not just that he looks and sounds like Elvis, it's that his very message feels like the continuation of Elvis's story. And that is why the theory refuses to die. Because for those who believe, Bob Joyce isn't just a pastor, he is Elvis Presley's second act, not on the stage but in the pulpit, not before screaming crowds but in quiet sanctuaries. He is the King reborn, not in music but in faith. But even Pastor Bob's compassion couldn't silence the storm. The movement only grew louder, stronger, more devoted. And when tragedy struck the Presley family years later, it reignited the rumor with even greater force. Because suddenly, the question wasn't just whether Pastor Bob was Elvis, it was whether Elvis had chosen to stay hidden for reasons the world was never meant to know. The question of Pastor Bob Joyce's true identity has never really been about proving or disproving a theory. It has always been about something deeper, the way people cling to legends, the way they wrestle with grief, and the way they search for hope in unexpected places. For believers, the idea that Elvis Presley might still be alive in the form of a humble pastor is more than a conspiracy. It is a story of redemption, of survival, of faith triumphing over the chaos of fame. The rumor endures because Elvis was never just another celebrity. He was a force, a symbol of rebellion, passion, and vulnerability wrapped into one man. His death in 1977 left a wound that never fully healed. Fans couldn't accept that the king of rock and roll could be silenced so suddenly, so tragically. And when Bob Joyce stepped into view decades later with a voice that echoed Elvis's soul and a message that spoke of transformation, it felt like a continuation rather than an ending. To his congregation, Pastor Bob is simply a man of God. He sings hymns, preaches scripture, and comforts the broken. But to Elvis's fans, every sermon, every song carries the possibility of hidden meaning. When he speaks of rebirth, they hear Elvis leaving behind the prison of fame. When he preaches about second chances, they hear a confession of a man who once lived in excess and found peace only by walking away. Whether intended or not, Pastor Bob's ministry has become entangled with Elvis's mythology. What makes the story even more powerful is how it reflects the struggle Elvis himself lived. He was a man torn in two, loved by millions but often lonely, celebrated as a god but aching for ordinary life. The theory that he could have left it all behind to become a preacher in a small town doesn't just sound plausible, it sounds like the ending Elvis might have written for himself if he had the chance. Yet the denials remain. Bob Joyce has said it plainly, "I am not Elvis Presley." Priscilla and Lisa Marie have both dismissed the idea as fantasy. The documents, the funeral, the memories, all point to Elvis's death being real. Still, the rumors thrive. Why? Because people don't really want them to end. The hope that Elvis lived on provides comfort, a way to imagine that he escaped the fate that consumed so many stars. For many, Pastor Bob's existence offers more than conspiracy. It offers closure. It paints a picture of Elvis not as a man destroyed by fame, but as a man reborn, choosing faith over fame, humility over power. Whether or not it's true almost doesn't matter. What matters is the meaning it carries for those who believe. And perhaps that is the true legacy of this strange, enduring rumor. Elvis Presley left behind more than music. He left behind questions about the price of fame, the fragility of greatness, and the possibility of redemption. Pastor Bob Joyce, whether connected to Elvis or not, embodies those questions. His voice reminds fans of what they lost, while his ministry offers the hope of what Elvis might have found: peace. The final word belongs not to Pastor Bob, not to skeptics or believers, but to the enduring human need to hold on to stories that heal. Elvis Presley may be gone, or he may live on in the hearts of those who hear him in the voice of a pastor. Either way, the legend continues, not as a perfect myth, but as a reflection of faith, longing, and the power of one man's influence across generations. And maybe that is the answer people have been searching for all along. Not whether Pastor Bob is Elvis, but why the world wants him to be. Because in that hope lies something greater than fact, a desire for the king to have found the peace that fame never allowed him. The mystery of Pastor Bob Joyce shows how much the world still longs for Elvis Presley, whether in truth or in legend. Do you believe Bob Joyce is Elvis in disguise, or simply a man with a gift that reminds us of the king? Share your thoughts and subscribe for more untold stories.
A lot of sorrowful feelings about the timing, because what's happening now, the rumors that are going about, is that
for years, I kept my mouth shut about that night. I watched documentaries, read books, heard so-called insiders cash in on their version of events. And every time, I felt sick, because I was there. I was standing just a few feet away when everything changed for Elvis Presley, and for the rest of us who thought the king was untouchable. People think they know what happened. They point to headlines, autopsy reports, official statements polished by lawyers and managers. They repeat the same phrases: it was his health, or it was bound to happen. But that's not the story I carry when I close my eyes at 3 in the morning. That night wasn't just about a body giving out. It was about a man quietly drowning while the rest of the world applauded. I wasn't family. I wasn't a doctor or some big-shot executive. I was the wall between Elvis and everything trying to grab a piece of him. My job sounded simple: keep the fans back, keep the crazies out, keep him safe. But after a while, I realized I wasn't just protecting him from strangers. I was trying to protect what little piece he had left from the people inside the walls. By that stage in his life, Elvis couldn't take a breath without somebody counting how much it was worth. Every smile, every wave, every show added up to somebody's paycheck. Folks talk about how lucky we were to be in his inner circle. I watched him pay for every perk with another piece of his soul. That night, people argue about, fans circle it on calendars, writers turn it into chapters. It didn't start with blue lights and sirens. It started quiet, too quiet. The house had that heavy kind of silence that makes you feel like you're trespassing just by breathing. The guys were moving around, phones ringing here and there, but underneath it, there was this pressure in the air, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. Elvis had been different all day, not throwing fits, not playing the star, just distant. He'd smile when somebody walked into the room, crack a joke, and then the second they left, it was like watching a light switch flip off. I'd seen him tired before. This was something else. I'd heard the whispers, same as you, the pills, the late nights, the weight of being Elvis pressing down harder every year. What you don't hear about is the way he tried to hold it together anyway. The way he'd drag himself up, get dressed, and walk out there like his body wasn't screaming at him to stop. People say, well, he made those choices. Maybe, but there were a lot of hands pushing him toward that edge. That night, I was posted close enough to hear the muffled music from the next room, close enough to hear the floorboards creak under his feet, close enough to know something wasn't right, even before the panic started. There's a rhythm to a house, especially one like his. You get used to the sounds, laughter here, a TV on there, footsteps going back and forth. Suddenly, all that rhythm stopped. I checked my watch once, then twice. The minutes felt heavier than they should have. I'd stood outside plenty of doors, waiting for him to say, "Come on in, man," in that lazy drawl of his. But this time, the door stayed shut, and the silence on the other side felt wrong in my bones. You know what hurts the most after all these years? It's not just what I saw when that door finally opened. It's everything I heard afterward. The statements, the spin, the carefully chosen words that made it sound like nobody could have done anything different. Like it was just fate. Maybe that helps some people sleep at night. It never helped me. I remember the moment my hand touched that doorknob. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Somebody behind me said my name, told me to wait, but I'd already made up my mind. I pushed that door open anyway, and when I saw what was on the other side, I knew nothing about Elvis Presley's life, or my own, would ever be the same again. To really understand what happened that night, you have to wind the tape back a little. Before the sirens, before the silence, before that door ever closed. By then, my days with Elvis all blurred together into this strange mix of glamour and exhaustion. People imagine bodyguards as tough guys in sunglasses, standing in front of screaming fans. Sure, there was plenty of that. But most of my job wasn't standing in front of cameras. It was standing in front of a man everyone wanted something from, and watching the price he paid for being Elvis Presley. From the outside, it looked like a dream. There were cars, crowds, women crying just to touch his sleeve. If Elvis wanted a burger at 3 in the morning, somebody made sure a whole bag of them materialized. If he wanted a song played again, it played again. But what I saw, day after day, was how much he had to give up just to keep all of that going. He could never just walk down a street. He couldn't sit in a diner without the whole place stopping. Every move was surrounded by security, schedules, obligations, and behind every handshake, there was somebody counting how much that moment was worth in ticket sales and merchandise. Inside the house, behind the gates, you'd think it would be peaceful. It wasn't. The phones rang like alarms. Managers, promoters, lawyers, old friends, new faces, every one of them had a favor to ask, a deal to pitch, a show to lock in. I watched him try to be everything to everyone. The star, the boss, the friend, the son, the ex-husband, the father. It was like watching a man trying to keep 10 plates spinning on sticks, while the ground underneath him cracked. The tension in the inner circle didn't show up in the tabloids, but it lived in the corners of the rooms. I'd hear snatches of arguments, money, tours, contracts, TV specials. Some wanted more shows, some wanted better deals. Some just wanted to stay close to the golden goose. They'd lower their voices when I walked in, but not fast enough. I heard plenty. "Don't tell him that now, he'll cancel. He doesn't need rest, he needs momentum. We can't afford another missed show." No one said it outright, but I knew what they were really afraid of. Not his health, not his happiness. They were afraid of the day Elvis Presley finally said, "No more." And then there was him, the man I saw when the doors closed and the crowd noise faded. Sometimes he was playful, making jokes, singing old gospel songs like we were just a bunch of kids hanging out. Sometimes he was quiet, staring at nothing, fingers tapping on the armrest like he was hearing music nobody else could hear. Over time, I watched the changes. He moved slower. Getting up from a chair took more effort. His breathing got heavier even when he wasn't doing much. There were pills, everyone knew that part. But what people don't see is how normal it becomes inside the bubble. Just to sleep, just to get through the show, just to calm down. You tell yourself it's under control until one day you realize it's controlling everything. There was one day before that night that still burns in my memory. We were getting ready for a show, the kind of night when thousands of people were already in their seats, waiting for the lights to hit the stage. Elvis was in his room getting dressed, and I was posted nearby like always. He stepped out, took a few steps down the hall, and I watched his face drain of color. His hand reached for the wall. For a second, I thought he was just messing around. Then I saw his eyes. That wasn't a joke. That was pain. "Boss, you okay?" I asked. He forced a little half smile. "Just tired, man." Tired. That word again. I suggested calling a doctor, maybe postponing the show. Someone behind me heard that and rushed in with the same old line. "We can't cancel. People flew in. It'll be fine. He just needs to get warmed up." Elvis straightened his shoulders, like he'd been caught being human, and waved us off. "They paid to see me," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Let's go." I moved closer to the door, not knocking yet, just listening. My own heartbeat suddenly felt too loud in my ears, like it was drowning out whatever I was trying to hear from the other side. "Elvis," I called out, just loud enough to carry through the wood. No answer. I waited. Tried again. "You all right in there, boss?" Silence. That was the moment the bottom dropped out in my gut. I'd stood guard outside hotel rooms, dressing rooms, back doors, side entrances. I dealt with drunks, stalkers, obsessed fans, angry husbands. None of that scared me like that silence did. One of the others came up behind me. "Give him a minute," he said, but his voice didn't sound convinced either. He probably doesn't want to be bothered. I don't know how long we stood there, arguing with our own instincts. I just know that at some point, the fear got louder than the excuses. I knocked harder. "Elvis, talk to me, man." Nothing. My hand went to the doorknob. In that split second, I thought about every line in the contract, every unspoken rule about privacy, every time I'd been told, "You wait until he calls you." But something inside me screamed that waiting wasn't an option anymore. I turned the knob. The door gave way, slow and reluctant, and my world narrowed down to what was on the other side. I won't go into details that don't need repeating. The tabloids turned his last moments into a sideshow. I won't do that. What I will tell you is this. I knew, the second my eyes found him, that this was not just a fainting spell or a moment of dizziness. This was bad. Worse than anything I'd seen before. I called out his name. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, high and cracking, like it belonged to someone else. People came running. In seconds, the quiet house exploded into chaos. Shouting, feet pounding, phones being grabbed, instructions flying over one another. "Call the doctor. Don't let anyone else in here. We can't let this get out." Even in that moment, with Elvis lying there, barely hanging on, The machine went to work. A story was already being built while we were begging him to respond. Even while someone dialed for help, someone else was thinking about headlines, about what could and couldn't be said. I focused on him, on the man I'd sworn to protect, on the face the world knew, and the vulnerability the world never saw. I kept talking to him, whether he could hear me or not, because it was all I knew to do. And somewhere in that blur, before everything finally went quiet, there was a moment, just one, when he looked at me and spoke words I've never repeated. Those are the words that have haunted me ever since. And those are the words I'm finally ready to share. When people ask me why I stayed silent for so long, I never know where to start. Do I start with the contracts, the fear, the pressure to protect the image? Or do I start with the look in his eyes in those final clear moments? Because that's the part I can't shake. In the middle of the chaos that night, before the shouting, before the frantic rushing around took over completely, there was this small pocket of time that barely anyone noticed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no poetic last words meant for the cameras or the history books. It was just me and him, and the weight of everything he'd carried for years. He was struggling. That much was obvious. The strong, larger-than-life figure the world knew looked suddenly fragile, like the man from Tupelo had come back to the surface for a second. The king, the icon, the legend, none of that mattered in that moment. He was just Elvis, a man who'd given too much for too long. I leaned in close, talking to him, begging him to stay with us, telling him help was on the way. I don't even remember half of what I said. My voice was shaking, my hands were shaking, my whole world was shaking. All I remember clearly is the moment his eyes found mine. For a second, everything around us went quiet in my head. The shouting, the footsteps, the panicked voices, they all turned into background noise, because he looked straight at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in a long time. And he said 6 words. I'm so tired of being Elvis. That was it. No speech, no drama. Just the rawest truth I'd ever heard come out of his mouth. Think about that for a second. A man the world worshipped. A man people lined up to see, cried over, argued about, dressed like. A man who changed music, culture, and history. And in the end, what slipped out of his heart wasn't pride or regret over a missed show or worry about his legacy. It was exhaustion, not just tired of the tours, not just tired of the late nights and the pills and the cameras. Tired of being Elvis, the product, the myth, the machine everyone expected him to keep feeding, even when it was eating him alive. Those words hit me like a punch to the chest, because I knew exactly what he meant. I'd watched him laugh for people when he didn't feel like laughing. I'd watched him walk on stage while his body was begging him to lie down. I'd watched him nod along while people made decisions about his life like he was a brand instead of a human being. I'm so tired of being Elvis. For years, I kept those words locked up. People asked me what happened that night, what he was like at the end, what he said. I gave them the safe answers, the rehearsed lines. He was tired. He'd been under a lot of pressure. He gave everything to the fans. All true, but not the whole truth. The real truth was uglier and quieter. It was in how alone he felt at the top, how trapped he was inside an image the world had built for him, how hard it was for him to just be a man without someone trying to turn that moment into money. I told myself I was protecting him by keeping that line to myself. I didn't want to see it twisted into headlines or memes, printed on t-shirts, turned into gossip. I imagined it splashed across magazine covers. Elvis hated being Elvis. That wasn't what he meant, and I couldn't stand the thought of people using his pain as entertainment one last time. So I swallowed it. I let the official stories roll out. I watched as people debated the cause of death like it was a puzzle to be solved, instead of a tragedy born from 1,000 ignored cries for help. I listened as they blamed the food, the pills, the entourage, the schedule, even him. But they never blamed the weight of being Elvis Presley. Over the years, that sentence followed me everywhere. I'd hear one of his songs on the radio, and there it was. I'd see his face on a poster, and I'd hear it again. Anytime someone talked about him like he was just a wild rock star who burned out, I wanted to grab them and say, "You don't get it. He wasn't just reckless. He was tired, bone deep, tired." I'm not sharing this now to add to the circus. I'm sharing it because if you really love Elvis, if you're one of the people who still listens to his music, still feels something when his voice comes through the speakers, you deserve to know that behind the legend was a man who carried more than any one person should have to. He wasn't perfect, none of us were, but he was generous. He was funny. He was kind in ways the world never saw. He gave away cars, jewelry, houses, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because making other people happy gave him a brief break from his own sadness. When he said, "I'm so tired of being Elvis," what I hear now isn't just exhaustion. I hear a plea to be remembered as a human being, not a scandal, as a son, a father, a friend, not just a headline. Maybe speaking up now is my way of standing guard over him one last time. Not with my body, but with the truth. Not the sensational kind, the kind that hurts, but heals. Because if you remember him only for the way he left this world, you miss the miracle of how much he gave it while he was here. If Elvis still means something to you, let it be more than a rumor or a punchline. Comment your favorite Elvis song or memory below so the man behind the legend lives on through the people who truly cared. And if you want more untold truths, don't forget to subscribe.
I was 12 years old, living in North Memphis, and they had played the record the first time the night before. And it was basically a rhythm and blues station.
He is 86 now, and most people who pass him would never guess how close he once stood to the most famous man on earth. The jawline is softened, the hair is thin, and his hands hesitate when he picks up a glass. To the outside world, he is just another old man fighting gravity and time. Inside, he is someone who has carried one night in his chest for almost 50 years, a night he has never really spoken about until now. Over the years, people tried to drag that night out of him. Writers sent contracts thick as phone books. Television producers promised primetime specials. Fans sent letters in shaky handwriting asking for the real story about Elvis. In those final years, each time he said no. After the sirens stopped and the newspapers moved on, he swore he would not turn Elvis's worst moments into his own retirement plan. Keeping quiet was the only way he knew to stay loyal. That loyalty meant watching other people tell the story instead. He has sat alone in front of his television and listened to strangers piece together Elvis's life from secondhand quotes and half-remembered nights. He has heard men who barely made it past the front gates of Graceland speak as if they knew every secret in the house. He has looked down at his hands, knowing there are things he saw and heard that would change the way people talk about Elvis forever, and choosing again and again not to open his mouth. The rumors were the worst part. Conspiracy theories that said Elvis never died. Stories about secret islands, plastic surgery, new passports, a king hiding in plain sight. Every time someone swore they had seen Elvis pumping gas or buying groceries under another name, it hit him like a small punch, because he knew what nobody out there understood. There was a night when Elvis truly vanished from the life everyone thought they controlled, and it had nothing to do with fake identities or staged deaths. It happened long before ambulances flashed red and blue outside Graceland. On paper, it was supposed to be a quiet night. No show, no flight, no screaming crowds waiting in some other city. Elvis was meant to be at home, moving through the same rooms he had walked 1,000 times. The staff believed they knew where he was. Security believed they knew his routine. Then, somewhere between one breath and the next, he was simply not where he was supposed to be. He remembers that realization like it happened last week. The weight of the house keys in his pocket as he checked room after room. The way the big familiar spaces suddenly felt too wide and too empty. Guards trying to sound casual on the intercom while their eyes betrayed something closer to fear. Elvis Presley, the man the world could track by taillights and flight numbers, was off the grid inside his own kingdom, and nobody could say when he had slipped away or which direction he had gone. To understand why that memory still keeps him awake, you have to understand who Elvis was to him before the chaos. This was not just an employer. They were two Southern boys who had shared long car rides, greasy diner food, bad jokes, and better secrets. He had watched Elvis buy Graceland not as a trophy, but as a promise to his parents that they would never be poor again. He had seen the kid from Tupelo trying to carry a grown man's burden long before his body was ready for it. Because of that closeness, he started noticing the cracks earlier than most. The nights when Elvis sang gospel until sunrise because he did not want to be alone in his own head. The long flights where the laughter died and Elvis stared out at the dark through small oval windows. The way the medicine bottles multiplied and the jokes about disappearing for a while slipped into conversations more often than anyone wanted to admit. At the time, those lines sounded like worn-out humor. At 86, he hears them now as warnings they all ignored. For decades, he has lived with the knowledge that there was one night when those half-jokes turned into something real, when Elvis actually walked out into the Memphis darkness without telling the people who would have followed him anywhere. He knows where that drive ended. He knows what was said when they finally found him. He knows how the look in Elvis's eyes shifted from restless to something closer to resigned, like a man who had already stepped one foot out of his own life. And he knows that once he shares this story, there is no pulling it back. Once he describes the roads, the words, the moment Elvis used the word disappear in a way he never had before, fans will debate it, twist it, argue about what it means. That fear has kept him quiet longer than any contract. But time has taken his speed, most of his friends, and nearly every chance to speak in his own voice. What it has not taken is his memory of that night. So he sits down now, slower than before, but surer than he has ever been, and finally lets the sentence cross the line between his mind and the air. There was a night when Elvis Presley disappeared long before any coroner signed a piece of paper, and he was there to see it. Then he looks straight ahead as if he can see both the past and the people listening, and admits softly, that was the night Elvis disappeared. And I have never told anyone exactly what happened until now. It began like 100 other nights in the last stretch of his life, the kind of evening that should have blurred into all the others. The house was awake even though Memphis was not. Lights burned in rooms nobody was using. A television mumbled to itself in a back bedroom. Somewhere downstairs, somebody was frying something they should not have been eating at that hour. On the schedule, there was nothing dramatic planned. No stage, no airport, no screaming crowd waiting on the other side of a curtain. Elvis was supposed to be home, inside walls that had seen every version of him. He remembers the air feeling heavy even before anything went wrong. Elvis had been restless all day, pacing from room to room with that slow, uneven stride that said his body hurt more than he would admit. He held conversations in fragments, starting a sentence about business and ending it with some half-forgotten joke from Tupelo. The medicine bottles had become part of the furniture. Open a drawer and they were there. Move a jacket and you might hear a rattle. It made the friend feel like he was walking through a pharmacy that had been disguised as a mansion. There was a moment just after midnight when everything still felt salvageable. Elvis stood in the den, turning a small bottle over in his hand like he could read his future in the label. Music drifted low from a pair of speakers, one of those gospel records he always went back to when his nerves were bad. The friend watched him stare into the middle distance for a few beats, then watched the familiar mask slide back into place. Elvis cracked a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, said he would be upstairs in a bit, and waved him off like it was nothing. The call that pulled him away was trivial. Some question about arrangements, some argument between staff that needed a grown voice to settle it. He left the room annoyed but not alarmed. In his mind, Elvis was 15 steps away from a bed. Maybe 20 away from the bathroom. Nowhere near danger. He handled the dispute, signed something, told two grown men to stop acting like children. It took longer than he thought. When he finally turned back toward the heart of the house, the weird quiet hit him like a wall. At first, he blamed the feeling on his own nerves. Graceland could fall silent in a way that felt peaceful on some nights and haunted on others. He went to the den and found an empty chair, a half-finished drink sweating on the table. The Kevin were to record the stees, pure nature, and the trigger still turning in slow circles. He called out, not loudly, expecting an answer from the hallway or the stairs. The only reply was the soft crackle of the needle running in the groove. A chill walked up his spine before his brain had time to give it a name. He started with the obvious places: upstairs, bedroom, bathroom, dressing room, the music room. Each door swung open on spaces that felt like someone had just stepped out of them. A jacket tossed across a chair. A pair of shoes kicked half under a table. Signs of a man you could not lay eyes on. His voice grew firmer as he asked guards when they had last seen Elvis. One said it had been an hour, another said longer, and suddenly the timeline that kept everyone calm began to crumble. The fear did not arrive in a scream. It seeped in through small things. A back door that was unlocked when it should not have been. A car that was not where it belonged. A guard swearing he had not seen anybody use the front gate. Elvis was a grown man who had once roamed entire cities without anyone knowing where he was. But this was different. This was a body that did not handle exertion well anymore. This was a heart that had been warned. This was a man whose bad days were getting closer together, not farther apart. He moved faster than his memory likes to admit. He sent people to the grounds, to the stables, to the little building by the pool. He listened to the crackle of radios as voices checked in, each one coming back with the same useless report. Nothing. Elvis's father was asleep. The world outside the gates kept breathing, completely unaware that inside, the man who drew crowds like a magnet was unaccounted for in his own sanctuary. The friend stood in the doorway, staring out at the dark Memphis streets beyond the stone walls, and realized Elvis had done what he had been joking about for months. He had slipped away. He knew where to look, not because of any security camera or clever plan, but because he knew the man. When Elvis talked about disappearing, he never described beaches or foreign countries. He talked about small places, quiet corners, the kind of churches and streets that looked like the world before it recognized his face. So the friend took a set of keys, climbed behind the wheel, and pointed the car toward the side of town that still smelled like his own past. He found him parked outside a tiny brick church that had no idea who sat under its faded sign. Elvis was in the front seat, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let air in. No disguise, no effort to hide. He looked less like an outlaw on the run and more like a man who had driven back to the last place he remembered feeling simple. When the friend opened the passenger door and slid in, Elvis did not jump or apologize. He gave a small, tired smile, like he had been expecting him all along. The conversation that followed did not sound like the banter people imagine. Elvis did not talk about fame or money. He talked about weight, the kind that settled on his chest when he tried to sleep, the kind that pills could not dissolve. He admitted there were nights when he looked at his own reflection and did not recognize the man staring back. He said he felt like he was watching Elvis Presley from the outside, like a character someone else was playing, while the real him sat somewhere in the dark, waiting to be noticed. The friend tried to pull him back with the names that always worked: Lisa Marie, Vernon, the fans who sent letters by the bagful, the ones who still cried at the gate years after the first hits faded from the charts. On late nights, he would see a familiar incident described on a talk show and feel something in him flinch, not because it was entirely false, but because important pieces were missing. Nobody knew about the night when Elvis slipped out of his own house to sit in front of a church and talk about vanishing. Without that context, the picture the world saw felt crooked. Years slid into decades. His own body began to send warnings he could not ignore. Knees gave out, breaths came shorter. Doctors started using the same patient, calm voice on him that he had once heard used on Elvis. Each time he looked at a prescription bottle, he thought about that label in Elvis's hand. Each time he lay awake at 3 in the morning, he knew exactly which memory was going to show up first. It was always the car, the church silhouette, and the sentence about not coming back. The belief that silence was the most loyal choice began to crack as his days grew shorter. He started to wonder who exactly he had been protecting all this time. Elvis was beyond scandal. The people who had profited off his exhaustion were mostly gone or fading. The only ones left, for the most part, were the fans who still stood at the gates with flowers and children who knew the songs from worn-out records their grandparents played. Those people were not asking for a cleaner myth. They were asking to know the man. Sitting in a small house far from the noise of the old days, he found himself thinking less about protecting Elvis's image and more about whether he had robbed that man of something important by staying quiet. If the world had understood just how trapped Elvis felt, would they have begged harder for mercy on his schedule? Would they have looked at him with more compassion and less judgment during those final years? There were no answers, only questions circling the same regret. One truth became impossible to avoid. The story he had carried alone was going to outlive him one way or another. Either it would die with him, leaving that night forever hidden between two faded men on a forgotten Memphis street, or he would finally open his mouth and risk being misunderstood. As his hands shook and his voice thinned with age, the fear of twisting the memory started to feel smaller than the fear of never letting anyone see how human Elvis really was in that moment. For most of his life, people talked about Elvis in extremes. He was either the untouchable king or the sad cautionary tale. The friend, in his 80s now, knows the truth sits in a quieter place. When he finally says, "The night Elvis disappeared," he hears how it sounds. He knows people will imagine secret flights and new identities. That is not the story he is telling. He does not challenge the official ending. Doctors signed what they had to sign. The world has its date and its reports. What the world never saw is that, for him, Elvis began to disappear on a different night altogether. Outside that small church, in the stillness of a parked car, he listened to a man who was supposed to be larger than life talk, in a calm voice, about wanting to step out of his own skin. In that moment, something in Elvis let go. He spent years trying to find the right word for it. Depression felt too clinical. Exhaustion sounded too small. Fame was part of the story, but not all of it. The closest truth he can reach is this: hope slipped away. The belief that he could pull his life back into a shape that did not hurt slipped away. The part of Elvis that still believed he was a boy from Tupelo who had gotten lucky instead of a product that belonged to everyone else started to fade. Daily life did not stop when that happened. there were still bursts of the old magic. The friend can bring back the sound of Elvis laughing until he wiped tears from his eyes, the warmth of sudden generosity, the gentle way he could treat a stranger's child. Those memories shine, and they are real. Yet even in those moments, the friend saw a distance in his eyes, as if some part of him was standing just outside the room, watching. One short exchange near the end fixed that feeling in place. After a show that had gone better than most, they were alone for a minute. Elvis looked at his stage suit and, without turning his head, asked if the friend remembered the church. When the answer came, he said, "That was me trying to see who I was without all this." He did not add anything else. That single line told the friend more than any long speech could have. The man and the legend were pulling apart, and only the legend was being fed. For a long time, he kept that night and that sentence locked away. He believed that if he shared them, people would twist his meaning and use it as fuel for the rumors he despised. If the world heard that Elvis once vanished for a few hours and talked about not coming back, some would swear it proved their belief that he was still out there. What he wants them to hear instead is much harder to accept. Elvis did return to Graceland. He walked back through the gate sits. Kibachi Hanisepta Ashusta and Idigumanson and Pumsumberdikshawn woke up under that same familiar ceiling. The disappearance he speaks of does not show up on a map. It is the point where a man's spirit steps back from a life that keeps marching forward without him. Growing old changed what he felt he owed this story. Standing at his own sink, lining up his own prescription bottles, he began to understand in his bones how it feels when your body and your name no longer match the person you remember being. Little by little, fear of feeding conspiracy theories shrank beside a different worry: that fans who loved Elvis might never be told how human he really felt in those last years. So breaking his silence now is not an attempt to rip away a myth. It is a way to add one missing piece. When someone leans on the Graceland gate or sings along alone in a car far from Memphis, he wants them to know they're not reaching toward a statue. They're reaching toward a man who, on at least one restless night, sat in the dark and wondered if anyone would still see him if the crown slipped. As his own life narrows, he accepts that people will keep arguing over what happened to Elvis. Some will hold fast to stories of escape. Others will only trust the medical files. Inside, he will always measure it differently. For him, the turning point came in that parked car outside a modest church when a tired voice admitted it did not recognize the life it was living. That is what he means when he says Elvis disappeared. Not a body vanishing into a new country, but a soul slowly stepping away from a story it could no longer carry. What brings him a small measure of peace is the thought that somewhere a listener will hear this and stop seeing Elvis as an untouchable monument. Maybe they will picture a complicated, fragile man who loved hard, gave more than he had, and who, for one lonely night, tried to step outside his own legend and could not quite find the way back. If you stayed with this story to the end, you are part of the small group who wants the man behind the legend, not just the myth. Subscribe, like, and tell us which untold night or relationship in Elvis's life you want us to gently uncover next on this channel.